The click of the handcuffs was the coldest sound I had ever heard. My own son, a police officer in the uniform I had helped him iron for his graduation, was fastening the steel around my wrists. On my own front lawn, his wife, Sophie, stood beside him, her face a mask of practiced concern. She slapped me then, a sharp, stinging blow that made my ears ring. "She's lost her mind," Sophie screamed, her voice pitched for the benefit of the neighbors who were now frozen on their porches. "We had to call for a wellness check. She's a danger to herself." They said I was unstable. They said I needed help. I stood there, rain soaking through my thin blouse, the metal biting into my skin, and I realized there was something far worse than their lies. It was their silence in the weeks leading up to this moment. They thought I was powerless, a relic to be managed and discarded. They didn't know I had spent 30 years helping to write the very system they were now trying to use against me. They had no idea the kind of woman they had just handcuffed. The house had stopped feeling like mine months ago. The same house I'd bought 32 years ago, with the payout from my husband's life insurance and the money I'd saved working late shifts in the county's emergency policy office. My name wasn't on the new title. I had asked my son, Michael, to add his name to the deed 5 years ago when I was battling pneumonia. A temporary measure, I thought, for medical power of attorney. He never added mine back. I still paid the property taxes. I paid for the new roof last spring. But when the workers were there, Sophie had asked me to stay downstairs. "You make people uncomfortable, Eleanor," she'd said. Most nights, I stayed in my small downstairs room, a self-contained world with a mini fridge and a hot plate. They would leave my dinner on a paper plate outside the door as if I were a contagious patient. They had started calling it their home out loud in front of me. The sting of those 2 words was sharper than any slap. One afternoon, Sophie barged into my room without knocking. She needed the space for her new home office, she announced. It made more sense, she said, if I moved into the sunroom. Or better yet, looked into one of those senior facilities with a nice sense of community. Michael stood behind her, silent, arms crossed, his gaze fixed on a point just above my head. His silence was the cruelest sound of all. That night, listening to their laughter drift down from upstairs, I knew. He hadn't just chosen a side. He had co-authored the plan. If you've ever sat in a house you built, surrounded by a family you raised, and still felt invisible, then you understand. You understand what it means to lose your place in your own home. And worse, to realize you were never even missed. It had escalated with a stack of papers on the kitchen table. Sophie sat there, dressed for a closing, a pen tapping a restless rhythm on the countertop. Michael stood by the fridge, a silent, uniformed sentinel. He pointed to the chair, a deposition, not a family breakfast. Sophie slid a folder across the table. "To make things simpler," she said, her voice smooth as silk. She used the word streamlining. I asked who drafted the documents. "A friend," she said. "Real estate law." The first page was a full transfer of ownership of the house, a joint gift with immediate effect. No clauses, no protections, no right to remain. "What if I don't sign?" I asked. Her smile never faltered. "You can stay as long as you want, of course, but things are getting more complicated. Taxes, insurance, liability." I told them I needed time. The next morning, Michael knocked on my door. It was unusual. He asked if I was ready to sign. And I said no. He just nodded and walked away. That evening, the light bulb in the hallway outside my room was gone. I heard them in the attic, the shuffle of boxes. They were already clearing out my life. The final straw came 3 days later. I walked into the living room to find them by the fireplace. The photo of my late husband had been turned face down. In its place was a new glossy picture of Michael and Sophie smiling in front of one of her real estate listings. That night, I discovered half of my storage boxes in the hallway closet were gone, replaced with bins labeled in Sophie's perfect cursive: marketing supplies, office inventory. They weren't just moving me out, they were erasing me. The next morning, Sophie announced she had booked a tour for me at a local senior living community. It wasn't a suggestion. I reminded her that this was still my house. It used to be, she corrected me, her voice losing its gentle edge. Michael stepped in then, hands on his hips. This wasn't about ownership anymore, he said. It was about what made sense. They had plans. The house needed to evolve. I was part of its past, a relic. I felt my knees go weak, but I stood my ground. I walked to the back room, where I kept my old professional files in a locked cabinet. It was open. The folders were gone. Manuals I had written, training guides, court notes from my time in protective services. All empty. That evening, as they prepared for their wellness check performance, as the rain began to fall, I walked back to my room. From a locked box under my bed, I retrieved something I hadn't touched in years. It was a small, flat, black transmitter. When I retired from the Department of Protective Services, they never asked for it back. It was a legacy device, an emergency beacon meant to alert the Internal Investigations line when an agent was witnessing abuse from within the system. I pressed the test button. A tiny green light blinked once. I didn't have a full plan yet, but I had a weapon they didn't know existed, and that was enough. For the next few days, I became a quiet archivist of my own demise. I started noticing everything. The subtle phone calls between Michael and his precinct captain, a man I knew named Morrison. A folder on the kitchen counter labeled Transfer of Guardianship. A browser tab on Sophie's laptop opened to the county clerk's website. It wasn't just about the house anymore. They were building a legal cage. I found an envelope addressed to an elder care attorney. The return address was Sophie's real estate office. I didn't confront them. Instead, I went to the garage. From a locked chest on the top shelf, I pulled out my own files. I had co-written half of the compliance manuals on elder abuse response, still in use by the state. I knew the system, I knew the loopholes, and I knew how to document. I printed screenshots of old texts with Michael, the ones where I'd explicitly stated that adding him to the deed was a temporary measure for medical power of attorney. I photographed my medication bottles, all perfectly organized. I downloaded the video from the small security camera I'd kept hidden in my room, the one that had captured Sophie rifling through my drawers and removing my professional files. One night, I heard them in the kitchen, their voices low and confident. Sophie was laughing. "By the time she realizes what's happened," she said, "the paperwork will be filed. Guardianship cases don't need much proof if the story is emotional enough." I wrote that down, word for word. It was then I decided. The next morning, I activated the transmitter, not with a dramatic gesture, just a single 1-second tap. It would send a silent, encrypted alert to the state's Internal Affairs Office, time-stamped, with my old clearance code attached. Then I waited. The wellness check was scheduled for 10 o'clock a.m. Michael came downstairs in his uniform, but his badge wasn't clipped to his chest. He was carrying it. That was a deviation from protocol. "We have a guest arriving," he said, his voice flat. "Someone from the department." 10 minutes later, a black, unmarked SUV pulled up. Then another, and another, 5 in total, pulling up to the curb with a quiet, synchronized precision that made the hair on my arms stand up. Captain Morrison was the first one out. He didn't smile. He asked for Michael by his full name, not as a colleague, but as a subject of an inquiry. Sophie appeared in the doorway, dressed in a sharp blazer, ready for her performance. But when a second agent stepped past her and requested to see her real estate licensing documents and all client intake forms from the past month, her practiced composure began to crack. I stepped back, a silent observer in my own home, as the room filled with quiet, methodical agents. There was no shouting, no struggle, just the soft click of pens and the rustle of folders being unzipped. Michael never once looked at me, and I never said a word. I didn't have to. The system I had helped build had just arrived on my doorstep. I woke the next morning to the sound of birds, not the strained, muffled arguments from upstairs. The house was the quietest it had been in months. The agents had stayed for 3 hours. They moved with a chilling efficiency. One team focused on the guardianship papers Sophie had drafted, noting the lack of medical certification. Another reviewed Michael's recent use of department databases. It turned out Sophie had used his badge number to pull my prescription history, building a false narrative of cognitive decline. By noon, I received a call from an internal affairs agent named Rachel. She thanked me for using the legacy emergency transmitter. It hadn't been activated in 15 years, she said. They had matched my code to a dormant but verified clearance profile. Then she told me they were reopening a previously sealed investigation. I knew what she meant. 5 years ago, I had filed a formal report against Captain Morrison for mishandling elder protection protocols. He had retaliated by quietly cutting my department's funding. I had kept the records of his malfeasance. I had never used them. But now someone else had. A full audit of his precinct was underway. Michael came home late that night, alone. His steps were heavy on the stairs. He walked past my room without a word. Sophie never came back. The next day, a notice arrived from the Office of Property Claims. It listed me as the disputed occupant and them as the temporary transferees. I called the number. The clerk on the line recognized my name. She said a flag had been placed on the title transfer due to inconsistencies with signatures and mismatched dates. All changes were frozen, pending a full review. The house was still mine. I had survived. But with the relief came a wave of grief so profound it buckled my knees. Not for the betrayal, but for the son I had lost. The boy who once hid behind me during thunderstorms had learned to stand tall by trying to erase me. He had chosen her plan. He had watched me shrink. I no longer hoped for an apology. I simply knew, with a final, aching certainty, that I would never trust him again. The days that followed were a slow, quiet unwinding. Michael barely spoke. He stayed upstairs, the door to his room shut, his voice a low murmur on the phone with union reps and lawyers. His administrative leave, they called it. His badge was gone. Sophie didn't return. A courier came for her things, 2 large boxes, one of which used to hold my Christmas decorations. I opened the front door and let the man take them without a word. I spent that afternoon in the sunroom, the window open, letting the cool autumn air clear out the last of her cloying perfume. Then I went to my old files. In the original property folder was the deed, signed and notarized 20 years ago. My name, alone. And the amendment from 5 years ago, the one that added Michael, had a stipulation I had almost forgotten. It would revert back to sole ownership upon resolution of my medical condition. I had recovered from pneumonia in 6 months. I had trusted him to file the paperwork to change it back. That was my mistake. I took the folder to Althea, a retired civil claims lawyer and an old friend of my late husband. She read it slowly. The transfer attempt, she said, was likely fraudulent. Michael's signature had been copied from an old insurance form. The notary listed hadn't held a valid license in over a year. We filed an injunction. A week later, it was official. The county had issued a freeze on all title changes. The night I came home with the confirmation, the house was dark. Michael sat at the kitchen table, his shoulders slumped. He said he'd be moving out by the end of the month. No anger, no fight, just a quiet, hollow defeat. That night I made soup for myself. I set one place at the table, one bowl, one spoon, and for the first time in a very long time, the silence didn't ache. It settled around me like a blanket, familiar, steady, and mine. The house was still standing, and so was I. It was late September when Michael packed the last of his things. I didn't watch him leave. I just heard the front door close, A soft, final click. The house that was left behind felt too quiet. Not peaceful yet, just empty. I didn't try to fill the silence. I let it be. I began my own quiet reclamation. I found old emails Sophie had printed, proposals for turning the garage into a rental unit, budget spreadsheets titled Renovation Phase 1. None of them had my name on them. I fed every sheet into the shredder, but I also found things I couldn't erase. A photo of Michael at 10, a crooked smile and a missing tooth. A birthday card where he'd scribbled the word hero in blue marker. I didn't throw them away. I placed them in a sealed envelope and put it in the back of a cabinet. Some memories didn't need to be burned, they just needed to rest. Once the house was cleared of their presence, I stood in the middle of the living room and asked myself what this space should become. I called a contractor and had him take down the partition wall Sophie had put up. I drove to the small community center where I used to volunteer and offered to run a weekly circle for women over 60, a space to talk about dignity, power, and the losses no one names. The director smiled and said yes. On the way home, I bought a new blank notebook. That night I cooked for myself again. I sat by the window, a single candle lit, not for mourning, but to remind myself that this house still had light. The letter from the Ethics Review Board arrived on a Thursday. Michael's administrative leave was extended indefinitely. His badge was deactivated. He would not be reinstated. Janelle's real estate license was suspended pending a full investigation into fraud. It hadn't just been one cruel moment. It had been a systemic, calculated manipulation. That night, I sat in my new office, the sunroom, now repainted a soft, clean white. I opened my new notebook. I wrote down 3 names: Michael, Sophie, and my own. I needed to see them side by side, not as a family, but as actors in a story that was now over. The next morning, I called the county clerk. The woman on the line paused when I gave her my name. The property title, she said, had already been updated. As part of the investigation, all associated names had been removed. It was mine again. Officially, I hired a landscaping crew. They tore out the manicured, sterile hedges Sophie had planted and put in dogwoods, lavender, and a small stone bench under the old oak tree Michael used to climb. I watched the transformation from my porch, a memory being rewritten, not erased, but re-anchored. In early October, I received an invitation from the city council. They asked if I would consider joining a new task force on elder housing policy. My case, they said, had highlighted critical loopholes in the system. I said yes. The first meeting was in a modest brick building downtown. They were younger, sharper, but they listened when I spoke. They took notes when I told them how easily a decorated police officer had been able to file a guardianship claim without a shred of medical proof. They didn't look at me like a victim. They looked at me like a colleague. I ran my first women's circle a week later. 7 of us sat with tea and notebooks. No agenda, just space. A woman spoke of her daughter moving her into a trailer behind the main house. Another talked about signing over her pension. We just listened. When it was my turn, I didn't tell them everything. I just said, I used to believe that family was the safest place to rest. Now I believe it has to be the safest place to resist. That evening, I stood in my garden. The dogwoods had taken root. I ran my hand over the rough stone of the bench and thought about all the versions of myself this house had held. A young wife, a mother, a widow, a woman begging to be seen, and now, a woman who had stopped begging. A letter arrived. No return address. It was from Michael. He wrote that he was in therapy, that he finally understood the weight of what he'd allowed to happen. There was no apology, just a quiet, desperate accounting. I folded it and placed it in the drawer with the old photos, not out of sentiment, to remind myself that even silence can arrive wearing the language of regret. That night, I sat on my porch. The air was cool. The lavender bloomed. It sent a quiet anthem. The house was still, but it was no longer empty. It was filled with the steady, quiet presence of a woman who had been erased and had decided to reappear on her own terms.